I'm going to ask Neil to come back to the stage. I'm also going to ask Justin Cormack, the CTO at Docker, a technologist, and Margaret Hartnett, who is a hybrid between a lawyer and a technologist, somebody who is a patent attorney for many years and who is also an engineer, to come and join us. And what I'm going to do over the next half hour with this panel is ask them to help us explore and understand what we mean in terms of openness. So the Prime Minister, I think 4 weeks ago, posted on LinkedIn that in the UK there was going to be a high bar to open source regulation. At this stage, we haven't got any proposed regulation in the UK. We do have some tooling. And we've seen from Andreas the way that he's looked at disaggregating open source. So I'm going to be a little bit out there, and I'm going to come to you first of all, Justin. A long-term contributor to open source, somebody who's watched all of this confusion over the last year or two since ChatGPT came to the fore. What are we talking about here? What's open source when we talk about AI?
Well, I think that you know, when AI kind of burst on the scene, like there was just this kind of excitement about, wow, there's this thing, it's kind of amazing and can do things we couldn't do before. But I think that very soon after that, there was a kind of, you know, kind of questions about like, okay, what is this thing, or why can't I do what I want with it, and why, you know, is this all I'm going to get? And I think that you could see when the first open source models came from Meta that there was this pent up demand for something that people could play with and build on themselves, even if it was kind of restrictive at the time, but it opens the floodgates. I mean, you know, I work at Docker, we're a developer tooling company, and developers are obsessed by tools, but they like to build their own weird and wonderful tools out of all the bits they can. And, you know, like the figures suggest that like 70 or 80% of them are using AI, which is an amazingly fast adoption rate. But they want to build the weird and wonderful things, not just the kind of off-the-shelf, ask ChatGPT a question in the chat. They want to integrate it into weird things. They want to explore the space, understand the space, build tools that no one's thought of before, build interfaces that are weird, you know, to go with their weird modal editors they like to use. Like, there's a whole space of weirdness that developers want to explore, and out of which amazing things will come. But they need open components and tools and pieces to actually build this stuff from.
What are we talking about there? Are we talking about access? Are we talking about entirely open? What does that mean?
I think that, you know, the more open things are, the more you can do. Mm-hmm. Like if there's a point at which you're cut off and you can't do the thing you want to do, then that's a block. I think with, you know, but there are experiments you can do. I mean, people broke the license terms of the early open models, you know, just to find out what they could do quite quickly, and you know, what happened as, you know, more open stuff came out, people gravitated towards the stuff that gave them those extra freedoms, and that they weren't breaking the license terms, and they could kind of use within their organization, and also which, you know, another large thing driving it is like keeping access to their own data and control over their own data in the way they want, and not having to give their data to people who might do other things with it, their private data.
And I think what you're going back to, and I think it was Matt Barker who came sort of running up to me all excited about ChatGPT. I think you were the first person that told me they were using it, and this was wonderful, and this shifted everything, and suddenly AI was here. And of course, we looked at Llama, and Llama had been released into the research community, and somehow it was leaked. And I don't think we've got an answer yet as to how that was leaked. But somehow Llama was leaked, and of course this leaked open source, what do I mean leaked open source? That's not open source, right? Of course it's not open source. This leaked software was being used by people, and I think the fact that the open source community using it were able to get to the stage by last May where we saw genuine concern in corporates that they were not going to be able to have a moat around their investment. They weren't going to be able to leverage that investment they've made to differentiate themselves, and concerns that the open source community were developing AI faster than the companies could collectively. Now, that's probably the first time we saw the word open source being used wrongly, because, as Justin says, it was a license breach, right? People were using it without rights. Margaret, you have been a deep expert in the AI Act. If anybody I know knows any term of the AI better than you, I would be stunned. You followed the process through, you've written about it in February for us, and you've updated that in our new report. You've heard what Andreas has to say about open source and openness in AI. What does it mean for you? What's happening with this act that talks about free and open source software and gives it exclusions?
Well, firstly, there isn't a clear definition or a definition of free and open source software within the Act itself. The phrase is just used, it's just used within the Act, but then there are many aspects of the Act where the drafting, frankly, isn't great. And there's a lot of ambiguity within that. But if I can redirect the question a little bit, actually to an article you wrote recently, Amanda, which I thought was fascinating. You referred to a San Francisco Examiner article, which was talking about the disaggregation of the components within an AI system, specifically the distinction between an AI model and the program that's used for training it and the program that's used for implementing it. Very interesting, because I don't know if you might be aware that there's a very similar discussion ongoing in a very different area of intellectual property, namely in patent law. Have you heard of the emotional perception AI case?
No.
Well, that's a case where it relates to a system which is used for making recommendations for music to listeners based on their emotional state, rather than on the basis of the similarity of the music with the genre that they're actually listening to at the moment. And a patent application was filed with this, the UK IPO, and it was rejected on the basis that the neural network system or the claim, etc., related to a computer program, which is a statutory excluded subject matter under the Act. It was then appealed in the High Court, and the High Court actually did exactly what you're saying. The judge made a distinction between a neural network, where he said a neural network is not a program. Why? Because he talked about a computer program as a series of instructions which are essentially coded by a human programmer. Whereas a neural network, regardless of whether it's GPI or otherwise systems, if you're looking at a supervised system, it's a system that learns based on the objective function and the data that's being provided to it. And there's a distinction between the program that's used for training the system and the program that's used for implementing that system. The question then became, is an AI or an ANN then subject matter which is potentially patentable? Does it possess technical contribution? Well, it was about whether you can decompose a technically non-trivial learning objective into an objective function, which is essentially what somebody does who designs an ANN. You talk about the outcomes you want to achieve, and you define your objective function around that.
So bringing that back to the level that I and most of the room will understand.
Yeah.
Taking it away from the nuances and the neural networks. What we're saying is there's existing case law, and that case law in another area around AI already starts to show those distinctions, or something
Yes, absolutely.
more. And those distinctions are about decompiling or taking apart, disaggregating the AI. So when we want to talk about what open is, we've already got case law. But I am going to bring you back to the EU Act, which Andreas was talking about before as well. So tell us a little bit about where you see the AI Act going. It's in force, what, August?
So it's actually going to be published on the 12th of July, and then it will come into force on the 1st of August or 2nd of August, something like that, 21 days after. And then there's a transitional period which applies. And the transition period depends on the nature of the AI system itself. For example, prohibited systems, the ban that applies in relation to prohibited systems will exist within, I think it's 6 months, so by Christmas.
But at a high level, where is the EU AI going to take us? We're looking at an exemption for free and open source. Are we expecting in July to have something that tells us what that is?
I expect you'll see secondary legislation
Right.
to provide some clarity in relation to that, for example. I expect you'll probably see some litigation at various different stages because the drafting has ambiguities within that. But I think also, perhaps it's digression, but also there's a question about, when we talk about openness, for me, we're talking about transparency. transparency and openness are not the same thing. Transparency is about, not just about what's the architecture system, what was the weights, it's what were the decision choices as a designer of an AI system you had to make in designing that system, for example, and coming up with the objective function or otherwise. Well, it's
So,
the scarf.
while I'm fixing Margaret so she stops doing this noise while she's speaking, I don't think she minds me doing this. There we go, as a friend. We'll hear you a lot better now, I hope.
Thank you. So as a patent attorney, when I'm trying to understand an invention, I typically have to ask the inventor at length, why did you do this? Why did you do that? Because usually that's where the clever bit resides. It's certainly not in the weights. The weights is the end result.
Right.
So within the AI Act, there are requirements for disclosure information to the European Commission, which includes things like, okay, how do you deal with outliers? How do you know what an outlier is? How do you pre-process your data? How do you clean it? Did you use augmentation? What were the design choices you made? What were the trade-offs you had to make? These things are the really clever, interesting stuff for me, at least as an AI engineer.
And when we go back to that legislation, that act, and we think about how it comes into force and what it's going to achieve, there's a term that we hear bandied around quite often, regulatory capture, about how difficult it is to comply with. And somebody actually showed me a printout on a call yesterday of the Act, and it must have been that thick. Neil and Andreas have already had some time to talk to us about this. And Neil, one of the things that we've talked about is the article that Margaret referenced that I wrote for the New Stack was prompted by a San Francisco Examiner article that she's just mentioned. And the article was debating whether or not open source should be banned. And it's something I heard last year for the first time at a political party conference, but the people who were saying it there would not have known what open source was if you'd beaten them around the head with it. Openness, banning it, what do you reckon?
So the story I've heard from people who are quite in the know is that there's been active campaigning in the UK government which we haven't been given access to or been able to challenge for just that. And that's why it's been surfaced here and why we've fallen behind in terms of our rhetoric around open source. And rhetoric does lead to progress. You can see that in France. I found that story very concerning, that there are sort of private conversations between special advisors who are not capable of challenging what they're being told because they're not aware of the things they don't know, with people who hold these opinions honestly, but there are arguments to be had. Yet, on the same token, we had that launched at the OpenUK meeting, we had a wonderful select committee report that really laid out what the actual issues were. So my reaction to this is, well, first of all, to push back and say, UK government has debilitated itself in its understanding of these issues by losing its AI advice structure, and we should fix that. But then trying to be more constructive. So what are we actually trying to achieve? Because it was a great sort of characterization of what's going on in open source. And then trying to think about what does openness achieve? Margaret's sort of talking about that as well. What does the law see it as? Where are these things? This is a disruptive technology. We're going to probably have to think about how we treat it in the future. And for me, the reference for that is still the sort of notions you get in Popper's Open Society and Its Enemies, in terms of what are we trying to bring about? We're trying to bring about a society where well-intentioned people in society can collaborate in that Tower of Babel way without having to call each other up and saying, we're planning to fix this and planning to fix that. It's just the people who are expert, who are on the ground, seeing the problems, have the best tools at their disposal and the ability to fix those problems. And we're trying to do that simultaneously while stopping the baddies. And this is a sort of difficult problem. But, it's a difficult problem to do in the minutiae, and you can sit there imagining these artificial examples where the baddies win if they get this and then they get that, and create a lot of vivid scenarios. But the best practice we have is to say, well, let's educate the goodies and empower them. I mean, there's not much more we can do than that. We have to constantly monitor, we have to constantly be careful and not make the mistake that UK government has currently made, like shutting voices out of the conversation or not listening to certain people. But fundamentally, our starting point has to be, just as we're saying with the manifesto, education. Public service is a really great place to start because it's just a place that's been eroded. And I think when you look at the challenges we face, you can see that within the UK and probably in the wider world, there's been a massive loss of trust in professional expertise, an undermining of teachers, an undermining of civil servants, an undermining of all these people that we now need to step up and experiment and understand how to best use and deploy these technologies. They're sort of wading in and saying, you people aren't doing a good job, we're going to replace you with process. Well, if we accept that we're replacing everyone with process, then AI wins, because AI is just process. If we want to bring the humanity back into the equation, we have to empower and retrust people in society to build and deploy these techniques. So when it comes to openness in AI, those are the questions, that's the exam question, I think. That's what we want to achieve. And then there's a sort of set of tools in terms of legislation, and when I said regulatory capture, people say, oh, there hasn't been any legislation, how can you say that? That's not what regulatory capture is. Regulatory capture is about all decision making, and there are many facilities available to government to make decisions without legislating. In fact, we want them to make a lot of decisions like guidance or promoting things or prime ministerial announcements or whatever to try and drive the technology forward. And I hope, but I'm not sure, to be honest, I hope with the next government that they start taking that seriously and promoting that seriously, because time's sort of slipping away. And that's what sort of worries me for the UK. I mean, it's not slipping away for other places. Like they're going ahead and delivering on this, but for the UK, it's...
Well, to the extent we don't have anything that is restricting the openness right now, time perhaps is paused for the UK, and perhaps what we're seeing coming out of Europe might be more of a risk.
I think that's right, and I think it's so interesting. I was in Europe recently around the AI Act. I mean, and it's so great we've got Margaret who's read it in detail. I mean, my attitude towards it, it's so poorly thought through, it might just disappear. I've been far more interested in the Digital Markets Act, which is actually well thought through and is, of course, what Apple are now whining about. Yeah, I mean, look at the acts that the big tech really whine about, and those are the ones, and of course, we've got the Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Act coming through here, which is massively important in this space and almost uncommented on by the government itself and the press and everyone else. I think you're right that we don't have any legislation blocking, but what was interesting, and I think very much led by Yann LeCun, who's, I know there are problems with Meta's model, but the French government's response, driven by Yann sort of saying, you've got to go all for this, was President Macron saying, we're all going in on open. And they did that very early. And you were there in Paris. I was only seeing the tweets from Station F and all these sort of things, all these initiatives that have emerged from the lack of inaction, from the action. The regulatory capture mainly in the UK is manifested in inaction in this very, very important space. Whereas you see the contrast in France, and I'm less familiar with what's come out of Berlin, but you see a lot of activity in Germany in this space as well, despite the barriers of the AI Act, which they are all worried about and all talking about.
And that also should be lending an opportunity right now to the UK that we don't have that barrier. It is really interesting that you bring Meta into the conversation. So this time last year, we did a purely AI-focused report, and we launched it with Jimmy Wales, the founder of Wikipedia, and Meta. And OpenUK had done something quite controversial. If you look at the Llama 2 website, you will see OpenUK's logo there as a partner and a supporter of the launch of Meta. Now, at that time, we were already starting to look at what does openness mean, and we were talking about open innovation and open access because we knew it wasn't open source. And what we were seeing was Meta's website called it Open Innovation, and as soon as it was launched, Zuckerberg and then Yann LeCun called it open source. And of course, the open source community were up in arms, but open washing, and they're right to be concerned, but we are looking at a world apart. This is nothing like open source software, right? We're not going to be able to put a simple label on this. Andreas, we can't label it. We can look at what you've done already, starting to break it down. How do we take that forward? How do we get governments to listen to that work and to understand that open source means something different when we come to AI. Openness means something different, and this is what they have to look at.
Well, I think maybe it helps to reflect why open weights only has been so successful. So there's several benefits for the end user, right? For the end user, the problem is there's a conflation of what was previously traditional open source and what is open weights, right? You look at a piece of technology and you go, oh, I can use it for whatever purpose, I can do whatever I want with it, and it comes with a non-restrictive license. So that's nice, both is nice. And so for a lot of end users, I feel that's where it stops, right? And you're just, you're happy with what you get, and you get it for free as like a free lunch. And you go, okay, nice. And so this is how it works, right? This is how this conflation actually works between what's real, well, traditional open source and open weights only. And then from the other side, that's the end user, but from the other side, from the builder side, from the company side, there's also benefits of just releasing the weights, right? Because you put your product out, you can show off how powerful it is, and you can create lots of benchmarks and performance benchmarks just with the weights. And still, you get away with hiding a lot of information, right? So a lot of stuff that goes on under the surface, the data that went into the training, data that went into the system, is heavily obfuscated, right? So it's very hard to identify what actually went in there and how do we get it out again, right? So by just releasing the weights, you create that kind of interesting win-win situation for, well, at least some end users, and also for the companies who get away with not disclosing large parts of this technology, and thereby also avoiding legal exposure, right? And all the questions that come with, are we going to be held accountable, in what form, for the training data that went into our system, and so forth and so on. So these are all factors which contribute to how did we get where we are, right? So why is open weights only so widespread right now? And
if I could throw in a bit, I mean, as an IP attorney, I find it ironic that a tool which really relates to a copyright work, because you think about weights, it's a literary work, it's a table of numbers, is essentially being used to protect a trade secret, because that's what's really going on here. It's fascinating, actually.
yeah.
And if we bring that back to what Neil was saying before about the meta piece, now OpenUK controversially supported it because we thought anything going in that direction of openness, and we had a board decision on this because we knew it would be controversial. Anything driving towards open we thought was in the right direction. And since then, it's enabled us to be in the center of the conversation as we discussed what openness means. So we get asked, not necessarily by UK government, but we get asked to talk about what that means. And you were talking before about France having picked this up. You come from the Netherlands. Are we seeing a shift? So in Paris, the people I talked to actually said they thought London was the buzzy place. Macron's policies are very clear, and France is now the fastest growing in open source because of their AI engagement and the Macron policies.
I don't know. I mean, London's always been a really buzzy place. It's been a massive advantage, right? I think that it reminds me of like the Industrial Revolution, right? We were the first to have an Industrial Revolution, and then we never put any thought into how you sustain your technology base. So every other country in Europe prizes engineering as one of the most important degree programs, and in the UK, we're just like, oh, it's like, you know, it's vocational. And because they all had to put thought into how do we recreate what the UK is doing.
There's a second concern there, and I, as well as hearing people talking about banning open source, there is a move afoot to require you to have a certification to code from the UK. So,
I mean, I think most of these things, what's interesting about them is most of these silly ideas kind of fall by the wayside as you start to have a sensible conversation, or as you start to get towards implementation. But the challenge is they waste a lot of intellectual effort. I mean, if you look what happened in the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, in this most critical moment when we were running around screaming about AI safety, all our intellectual effort had to be put into convening a world summit about something that was unclear of its purpose, instead of building on the work that we'd already laid the groundwork of, that actually put the UK at the cutting edge of thinking about how to regulate this technology, and all driven by a notion that somehow things had fundamentally changed, when they hadn't changed. This is still a technology that is reliant on data. There are still rights around the data, and there is still an issue around how large companies exploit digital markets to gain power. And so those sort of regulatory agendas were somewhat disrupted here and replaced by these sort of arguments that have been made before, that were being made like 10 years ago about what might happen, but were processed through, but what's the policy action?
Yeah.
And then the policy action either turns out to be impractical or misguided for reasons that the proposers, and so you don't take that action, you double down on what you're doing. And we've just gone through that cycle relatively quickly across the last 18 months again. A series of policy actions proposed, no action taken, because when you analyze these actions, they don't actually have the
And we're
desired
going to
effect.
do a deep dive in just a couple of minutes into that data question. Justin, I think you were going to jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, I think you were right that the Llama releases did drive openness and innovation, and a lot more open things came out from that. I think what's going to be interesting is the next few years. Right now, fully open AI is actually very hard for most people to consume because it's so expensive to do training. Mm-hmm. And I think it's what's going to happen as training gets cheaper when the GPU shortage ends, and there's more innovation on making things cheaper, and the economics of really actually it being accessible to more people and really driving that. If we get to the point where universities can train an open AI level model, that's a very big difference from now, where it's really, really expensive.
And what's sort of super interesting about what's happened here is, although the big tech is claiming they've done these extraordinary things, all they've done is taken university ideas and supercharged them with larger compute and larger data. And because they could keep turning the dial up, and we've just seen reports in The Guardian today about what that means in terms of worldwide electricity consumption, now greater than Japan, because they could just afford to do that, they never stopped to think. And one of the really important things in open innovation in this space is, by saying that you have to do all this massive training in order to be at the cutting edge, which I think is not true because they didn't stop to think, they're excluding the notion that actually there are other ways of doing this, there are cheaper ways of doing this. And we already start seeing that in the open ecosystem. As soon as the Llama weights came out, people started showing things that no company had done, because the scale and breadth of the innovation ecosystem is greater even than Google and OpenAI can muster. What strikes me as bizarre about that is, at the time I was on the AI Council, shortly before it was disbanded, and we were telling government when they were sort of panicking about this, let's build BritGPT, we were saying there's going to be open models, and they were saying ridiculous, that's never going to happen, that's never going to happen. It's just like, we've seen this pattern again and again. One company will decide that their best option is to release models in some open way to disrupt the incumbents. That will happen. Don't make stupid decisions now. But they just...
And I think it might just be worth pausing on that and explaining how this works for anybody in the room who doesn't understand it. So why would you open up your crown jewels? My old boss, Mark Shuttleworth, who we talked about earlier, described open source as enabling your competitors with your own innovation. And it's painful and it's difficult. So why do people do it? Margaret talked about transparency, and that enables trust. It can also enable control if it's managed appropriately. Clearly, it brings more innovation. Justin, you've been talking about the access to do the weird stuff, and you can't do the weird stuff that the really innovative folk do if you don't have access. And frankly, it has to be a no-brainer for the UK, because we don't have a provider of an LLM that we want to open up so we get access. I have to draw the panel to a close, so what I'm going to do very quickly is, starting with Andreas. She pauses to give you a moment to think. I'm going to ask you in under a minute to tell us, if you were giving the UK government a piece of advice when they're elected tomorrow on AI, what would you tell them?
Well, a pressing issue, I feel, is plurality in this field, right? So we need more choice for the people, and we need to put the people's needs center stage for that. And we need to give people options of what technology they want to use when it comes to an open source AI. And I hope the government will push back on one side against the influence of big tech, which we have seen is very, very substantial in the EU, at least, and lobbying resources. And on the other side, also come to grip with regulating that technology in a smart way and drawing that line really in the right way, where you encourage smaller actors and those who really put in the work to make their system as open as it can be, give them more attention, right? So these are the ones which showed up on the top of the table that I showed, right? So then these are the systems that we want to give more credit and more attention to, and keep those others out, which use all these strategies such as open washing to take the oxygen out of that room.
Margaret, your 1 minute. What
gosh.
advice would you give them?
I'm going to say a few controversial things. Firstly, AI isn't just about Gen AI. There's a lot more of AI. People have been doing AI since, what, the 50s or thereabouts? So there's a hell of a lot more than it. Secondly, the discussions that I tend to hear are dominated by discussions about privacy. AI safety is a lot more than privacy. This is not just GDPR. If anything, it's GDPR on steroids. Let's talk to some engineers. Do some decent engineering stuff.
We can do that. Justin?
Yeah, I definitely agree. Like, talk to engineers, listen to the people who are building things with it, not just the people who are making a lot of money off it, but the people, the broader community. It's a tool. I think don't overweight on the fearmongers and the people who are kind of pointing out, the terrorists can use this. Like this is, it's a weird form of software. It's like the rest of, it's not that different from the rest of software. Software can do all sorts of stuff, and so kind of, we've just got some new things you can do with software, which are kind of weird and fun, and but not, it's not something that you need to over-regulate before it's even started. And the rest of the world's, going to be doing different things. So think about it in a global context. There's no point turning it off here because everyone will just go somewhere else.
Neil, you have the first word given the keynote in AI. I'm going to give you the last word, and you've got 1 minute. What would you advise them tomorrow?
The same thing we've been advising them for 8 years, gaps and overlaps analysis. It's critical. What are the gaps? What are the overlaps? Keep that analysis going. Do exactly as suggested. Do that in collaboration with the people who are building and deploying. You need good horizon scanning on that. That's been UK policy ever since Royal Society reports came out like 8 years ago. We should just bloody well implement it because, it's causing all sorts of uncertainties amongst businesses, technical people, to not sit down and say, what are the practical consequences of these technologies, and evolve that as they're coming out. Gaps and overlaps.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.